6:08. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Chris Cowden, and I'm the Director of Women in Their Work. And we are so pleased to have all of us together on this really bad night in Austin, but it's a great night for us to be together on Zoom. I want us to welcome the members of this that have taken part in this wonderful video. I mean, it's really powerful, it's poignant, it's meaningful. I hear it all day, and I still stop and listen. It's so moving. So I want to welcome the panelists that could come here tonight, and chief among our videographer and artist in residence at Women in Their Work as Ariel René Jackson. Thank you, Ariel, for being here. Ariel is everywhere right now. She has had so many really strong shows in the last year. And she's right now going to have a residency at Art Pace. So she came from her show, her Tito's Prize at Big Medium, to Women in Their Work, to Art Pace, and just on fire and doing magnificent work. So it's really, really a tribute. So let me begin by welcoming these panelists and telling you a bit about them. Ariel is a Black Creole anti-disciplinary film-based artist whose practice considers land and landscape as sites of internal representation. Themes of transformation are embedded in their application of repurposed imagery and objects, video, sound, and performance. Michael J. Love joins us here from New Jersey, right, Michael? Yes. He's an interdisciplinary tap dance artist, a scholar, and educator. His embodied research intermixes Black queer feminist theory and aesthetics with a rigorous practice that critically engages the Black cultural past as it imagines Black futurity. Michael's a 2021 to 2023 Princeton University Arts Fellow and lecturer in the program in dance at Princeton's Lewis Center for the Arts. Welcome, Michael. Vladimir Mejia is a multidisciplinary artist who works in installation, sculpture, photography, performance art, printmaking, and digital media, as well as the current curator of Collab Project's Instagram residency, Number Bit Res, and a member of the art collectives of Ink Tank and Rossi Destin. His work, while rooted in conceptual art, attempts to incorporate elements which make his pieces relatable to both audiences versed in art history and those who may be unfamiliar with it. Using interaction, humor, abstraction, and writing, he tackles politics, race, relations, generational divides, and the ever-evolving relationship between people and technology. John Yancey, welcome John, is an artist and professor of studio art, painting, and drawing, as well as Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion within the College of Fine Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. His work focuses in three main areas: paintings and drawings, community-based mural painting, and ceramic tile. He directed his first community mural in 1976 and has completed numerous public art projects and commissions since that time. His most recent projects include permanent public artworks for the Austin Convention Center, the Henry B. Gonzalez Convention Center of San Antonio, and the monumental history and culture art wall Rhapsody that occupies the Charles Erdy Plaza at 11th and Waller Streets as part of the restoration and revitalization of this historic street on Austin's east side. In addition to his public art projects, he continues to exhibit his paintings and drawings in gallery and in museum venues. I also want to mention the two other artists who were involved in the video. Artists Cindy Elizabeth and Deborah Roberts were unable to join us. So, but I want to be sure that everyone knows that that's the full group. So join me in welcoming Ariel and fellow artists. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for letting everybody know who is present today. And thank you, Michael, Vlad, and John. Thank you so much for your vulnerability and for, just understanding the conversation before we even spoke. I know I said that in email, but I really have been thinking about how we all knew what the metaphor was talking about. And even so, I received so many different comments from people from New York City, from New Orleans, in California, who have heard the stories and narratives and, recognize the systemic structures that are present in Austin as very similar to what they're dealing themselves. And John, I think about what you've been saying. You kind of have to pick your poison. You got to pick your brand of racism in choosing where to live in the U.S. So, in thinking that, I think I want to begin there because it's pretty. That's probably the newest thing. Yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts on that, and then we'll go into some of the questions that I have.
I don't know. Well, I suppose one of the things when you think about nationally, as I think about, I imagine, if I weren't in Austin, where would I be? Would I go back to Chicago? Would I go somewhere else? You think about the idyllic existence. If you're in a smaller place, that's, life is simpler. And, I'm looking at kind of having a slower kind of a pace, maybe sometime in the future. But there's an urban rural reality in our current climate. There were, I think, movements that were made many years ago that started to embed certain types of attitudes, certain types of perspectives in rural America as a community was targeted specifically in many ways to, in some ways, through talk radio and many of those things. And so, there's a different racism when you get to smaller areas and rural areas than you get into larger urban areas. And, it's hard to compare one better than the other, but they're extremely different in terms of how they function, how they operate, and so on. So it's an interesting question, particularly as we kind of think about where we are and at the moment we are, where these tensions are cycling. The tensions we are now are not new in the sense that unprecedented. It cycles, and they're throughout our history. This has cycled several times over. So we're just in this cycle again in many ways. But it does kind of make those questions very timely. Where do you feel safe? Where do you feel welcome?
Thank you. Yeah, I had a thought, but if anybody else has something to say just about how this work is resonating with other people in other states. Yeah, if Vlad or Michael, if either of you have any thoughts about that. I mean, Michael, I'm curious about you because, you've moved recently to New Jersey, and I wonder if, this work resonates with where you are now.
Yeah, I definitely have moved, and I think I've been here for only a few months at this point. But when I was watching the video, I was thinking a lot because I'm a lot closer to the Washington D.C. area where I'm originally from, and I haven't really been back or lived there since maybe summer 2006. So it's been quite a while. And even when I was last there. Oh, well, that's a lie. I lived there in like 2012, 2013 for like a year-ish. But even at that point, the gentrification had like changed the district. At that point, I was living sort of in Northeast, right over the border of like Tacoma Park. And I since have like driven through just like briefly, and there's like a Walmart, there's a Chipotle. So it's just like interesting how those parallels between like the city of Austin and the city of DC, right? How the neighborhoods are changing and folks are being driven out, and they're just, and those changes are so palpable and like felt and seen and so obvious. Yeah.
Yeah, the more I think about how these different systemic structures revolve around, you know, buildings being built or bridges being built, I think about what John brought up with things happening in a cycle, and and it feels like if I were to call it a type of cycle, it feels like a colonial one, like one where, you know, it like it worked the first time, and so it's just kept going and going. But with the invention of technology, of phones, of social media, and so I wonder, like, I don't know. I'll put this towards you, Vlad. Like, I think that the thing that changes the cycles, or changes how we understand the cycles now, is that I feel like we have more of a global or a national idea of what's going on, and not just what's happening in our local areas, but seeing that our stories are being told by other people with their own twist. And, you know, it feels the same, but I think technology has done something, maybe to benefit. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways it's made the conversation more inclusive, and people are more aware of how gentrification and how just growing up as a person of color in America, you're affected by it. And I think because we can talk about it with more people now, we can kind of point it out a lot easier. Because I feel like for me, I grew up in New York as a kid, and we moved around 2003, and I think that was like I lived in Far Rockaway, Queens, and I remember at the time that that area was heavily Latino and Black, and then now you go there and it's very much like a very desirable place to live in, where more of the affluent people live. And living in Texas, I feel like, especially in Austin now, as a grown up, I'm more aware of like what's happening as it's happening. And I also feel like a lot of my kind of passion or drive to have conversations about these issues comes from the fact that I was exposed at a young age to the idea of gentrification, the idea of white supremacy in America, because I had access to the internet. And even when I was a teenager, teachers weren't necessarily talking to us about that stuff, but I think like having access to the internet just makes us all more aware and makes us feel more comfortable talking about these things, because you realize that you're not alone in those situations. And for me, that I feel like that's what's made things feel more tense, but it's also because everybody's actually in on the conversation now, I think.
Yeah. The fact that everyone's in on the conversation, I think, is why the conversation in this work is the work. And I think for me, I recognized how I depend on, y'all, but also just wherever I am, I'm depending on other people's experiences of having been in a place longer than I have. And I think, that kind of tangible reliance and codependency goes way far, like further back. And now that same tradition of like forecasting of codependency is now amplified. And like you said, Vlad, very inclusive, because not only are we, I think, finding language and have language for describing what's happening to us, but, the fact that this conversation is not just one between Black people in their community, but also Black and Brown, is like, there are similarities, right, in how those systemic structures pits our indigeneity, our brownness, our Blackness against us systemically. So like, I think this next phase that our generation and future generations are going to be discussing is less about individual racism and more about the systemic one. And I mean, it's been a conversation, but I think it's very elusive, and the history there is very elusive. When I was driving from Austin to Bentonville in Arkansas. I traveled through Oklahoma, and I was listening to an audiobook called Sundown Towns by James Lowen. And he uncovered a lot of unofficial laws. And I think that's really where a lot of, I don't know, I would think that's where a lot of the systemic racism comes from, is like these unofficial laws that are created state by state, whether that is a social law or, you know, it's a real estate related law, but it's unofficial, is what James Lowen discovered about sundown towns and how they've been able to maintain a predominantly white community. So yeah, I think that's the takeaway that I'm having from the show. So I wanted to start there. The second thing that I wanted to discuss, and it's more of like a check-in question. So we had this interview nearly 2 years ago. And I remember, Vlad, it really stuck in my mind when you were saying that, you know, it's funny because we were talking on like near the anniversary of when you came to Austin. So it was like, you know, you were just like reconsidering those experiences. And so since we've interviewed almost 2 years ago, what do y'all feel has changed or remained the same? And what I'm talking about is, how has the pandemic maybe made you see certain things differently? Vlad, you and I talked about this a lot because we talked about how people's opinions have been changing, like pretty drastically in relationship to even 5 years ago. You know, before, I remember being gaslit in certain conversations when pointing out things that, you know, didn't seem right, or I was questioning, you know, why things were a certain way, why certain neighborhoods were separated or whatever. So the question is for all three of you, what has changed or remained the same, or what has remained the same from 2 years ago? I know it's a big, broad question, but.
Well, I guess I can start. One of the things that's changed a lot is the fact that we've had to communicate across technology like this, primarily. And so how you communicate and who you communicate with has changed a lot. And so we've had to adapt to conversations on screen like this. We've had to learn how to kind of communicate as rectangles within a rectangle. And that's changed in many ways certain dynamics. And not just how we communicate, but what we can communicate about. People have different comfort levels talking to a screen than they do sitting across the table from someone. They might say things in a different way. They might say things they wouldn't say if they were sitting across the way. So that, to me, that's, at least for me, if I talk about in the last 2 years, what's been the biggest change. As far as in the community, gentrification has continued. You know, I continue to watch new things go up and new people come in and old people leave. You know, I did get to know my neighbors, new neighbors, a little bit more during the freeze, as we all kind of had to communicate to figure out what we were doing and so on. But anyway, I think what we're doing now, to me, is the biggest change in the last 2 years.
Yeah, I kind of feel like something that I've been more aware of, I guess, during the pandemic is just accessibility is an idea, like who has accessibility and who has the privilege to work from home, like who can teach their children at home and who has to send them to school, and like who's forced to go work at those schools without proper protections. I think it's just kind of shown a light on where there is disparity, whether that be financial or social status, and just the reality that people of color, I think as a whole, probably have a much more challenging time accessing resources and making it through this pandemic, because a lot of safety nets are gone at this point. We had the first year and a half or so where we were, there were these government programs there, but the reality is that a lot of us got stimulus checks, and that was great. But where is money being invested in communities and schools? It doesn't really feel like that's happening right now. And I think that while the conversations have gotten better, there's still like this kind of a hill that we're still trying to get over, I feel like, to really like get to real change. Because I think like it feels almost like an early patting of people's backs right now, when there's still a lot of work to be done. And especially when, this pandemic is probably going to be with us for at least another year, another few years. And, how are we going to make it out of it when we do get to a point where we can say we've recovered, who's really the people that have recovered at that point? Yeah. And I guess that's just what I've been thinking more about over the last year or two is, how is it affecting us as people of color in general? Because I know that, I probably knew way more people that got sick during the pandemic than a lot of my white friends, mainly because of the kind of more like public work that a lot of people that I'm related to and friends with, who are people of color, those jobs that they have to take on and be exposed constantly, and usually making less than, our white counterparts.
I agree with you, Vlad, because I don't know, I just feel like the pandemic has illuminated inequality in such a real tangible way for everyone. So when the pandemic started, I was living in East Austin, and then I was able to like move to South Austin, like right off Barton Springs, so like a much more posh area. And I just remember how different that felt to like have access to like Zilker Park, to be able to like leave my house and like walk outside in like a nice place to walk outside. Like where I was living in East Austin, there weren't sidewalks in the same way, or like parks or like public spaces. I remember we had to like get in the car and like drive to Mueller to like be in a park to like leave our house and be outside. So just access was a huge thing. And then everything you were saying about folks who are able to like be at home, folks who are able to like have childcare, folks who are able to have the resources like a car and money to do like curbside, HEB orders, or to be able to like move throughout Austin like more safely, as opposed to folks who were like using public transportation or were having to go to work every day before, vaccines were readily and easily available. And even just like the vaccine process, like I remember having to like drive to like very, very, very North Austin to get my vaccine, when I knew folks who didn't have that option or the means to do so. So I just felt that a lot of the feelings and thoughts I was having about Austin were really being like exacerbated because I was like seeing people like really struggle, and I was trying to have to like figure things out. It took me a while to even be able to like return to my practice because I was living in an apartment. And I remember there was this moment where like everyone in dance was like, oh, just like dance in your house, like do, ballet bar at your kitchen. And like, I was like, well, not everyone has like a nice kitchen island that they could like stand at, or, I have downstairs neighbors. And like, as a tap dancer, like that's very different. So it's just like interesting how for some folks it felt like very like normal. And it was just like, oh, just like turn a space into your house into a dance studio and just like continue living your life from the inside of your house. And I was like, that's not, that's different for everyone. It's not always an option for everyone. But also, Ariel, speaking of how it's crazy to think that this interview happened like a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I remember like one of the questions, this is coming back to me now. One of the questions you asked me was if a Black person asked you, like what advice would you give, or would you advise a Black person to like move to Austin? Like what would you tell them? And I remember us like having this moment where we were like, I don't know if like someone my age was like, should I move to Austin? And they were a Black person. I don't know, but I don't know if I would tell them to move. And I'm just thinking of like now, 2 years later, like having lived in Austin for 7 years and like having left it, but still being very connected. Like I'm thinking about like whether or not that answer has changed for my, like even for me as someone, like would I come back? Um, I don't know. So I don't know. Those are two things I'm thinking about when you just asked the question you just asked. But yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I think I'm glad you brought up the fact that you've experienced like living in a place like East Austin where you didn't have as much access, and then whenever you moved into South Austin, it did change. And I remember when I would come visit you, it felt different. That it felt, because when I went to your apartment, I mean, people were outside, people were, being loud, but it felt comfortable for me. Whereas when I visited you in South Austin, I remember just feeling really anxious and my whole body would tense up, because, and maybe it really is simply because of how drastically it's different. I did grow up in the suburbs partially, and then apartments partially, and then in the country partially. And so I think it is important to think about how living in different spaces, your whole livelihood, the livability is, very different. Because yeah, since I've been in Texas, it's kind of crazy how I've been treated when it comes to voting, as if I'm not a citizen, even though I have a Louisiana ID. And so it's those little moments that pile up. And Delasia Foreman, who was my curatorial advisor, asked me a really great question when she saw the film. She was like, "So now what?" So now what? What's the next step? Like, we did the forecasting. What's the next step? And it was a great question because it forced me to go back to the metaphor and think about what that process is in terms of understanding what things to expect when you're going into a place. And once they get the information before they start to forecast, there's an analysis that happens, an analysis of all of the elements, all of the I don't know, math, I guess, that they would do once they get all of the information. And I think that's maybe the next stage. And also the fact that Martin Luther King, MLK Day was recent, and the Black History Month has started, has made me think a lot about what you said, Vlad, about the conversation being there, but the actions not being there, or the actions being not what we asked for. There's a lot that I can say about this, and yeah, it was interesting to, I think, to have those conversations at that time, because I felt like the conversations we had were like a culmination of pre-COVID. And so in hearing y'all talk about post-COVID or during COVID, I think things definitely have been exacerbated. And something that I said in our conversation, Michael, that I think still is in my mind when I was listening to y'all talk, is that sustainability and livability are not part of the conversation yet. So maybe the conversation isn't where it needs to be, because I think that there is a lot of pessimism, and as I'm getting older, I think, or maybe just more and more experience, I realize that the most radical thing that you can do is to be optimistic and to look for an answer. To look for a solution, because unfortunately the solution for sustainability and livability, I think, for Black and Brown people is sharing and having equity and having accessibility and feeling safe. Those require, I think, our white counterparts to share. And I think that really is, I don't know, what do y'all think? I mean, I feel like the disparity is going to be too great to where this country can't continue to function. Because if you're continuing not to share, and I mean freely share with Black and brown people who are doing the services that allow for people to have, academic jobs or, all of these other upscale jobs. If those people are not being taken care of, and, and I guess maybe difficult decisions aren't being made to sustain their lives, and where does that, John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's a question that is important now, because one of the things we have is, one, we're at a point where conversations were starting, and while there was a long way from that to substantive, investment, conversations were starting, which is why we're experiencing backlash, particularly here in Texas and states like Texas. So we're getting actually governmental initiatives to try to stop or shut down a lot of those conversations. I know we did a lot of like anti-racism, what is racism types of undoing racism types things. They were having an impact, people were understanding what racism was as a construct, that racism is not an attitudinal state of mind. It's a series of actually carefully built and maintained constructs that were constructed for a specific reason. And that specific reason was to serve a certain type of capitalism and a certain type of white capitalism. And the cycle we're in right now of racism, and you go back on the other cycles, they coincide with when capitalism goes to a high extreme. Basically, when race, becomes a tool for social control in many ways. In other words, it's easier to keep, particularly even white people, distracted, so they don't blame the people who are taking all the money. They blame somebody else. And so, that's kind of a pattern. That's one of the primary functions of racism. And where we are now is how do we leverage things to go? In the film, who made the comment about tech companies doing cluster hires of like 100 Black people?
Michael.
Michael. Yeah, I love that. That was great. Because actually, when they make these sweetheart deals of come to Austin and we'll give you tax-free hugs and loves and and enrich you in enormous ways, and you'll create these nebulous jobs somewhere along the way. How do we leverage that to say, well, wait a minute, we have inequities. Let's talk specifically about that. I really like that. I like that whole sentiment of like, get specific. There are incentives are being given out in this capitalism growing thing that Austin is becoming, and how do we use, even if in Austin it's more aspirational than reality, how do we use this notion that Austin wants to be a liberal city to leverage that so that when they start making these sweetheart deals, we start building those things in that are actual action items, structural items. So I really congratulate, kudos. I really love that comment. So
Yes. I think just in choosing all of you, all of y'all have had some kind of impact on what I saw in Austin. And it really, the fact that, John, when you in the film, I used the moment where you were saying, there are bright spots in Austin, and I think that goes for anywhere in the U.S. really, but they shouldn't be that hard to find, or like, I'm fairly privileged to be able to have met all of y'all in the situations that I have. To be an artist is truly a luxury. So the last question I'm going to ask you before I guess we get into questions is a combination of two of the questions I sent to you in an email, mainly because John brought it up about Michael. And are there any realizations, any aha moments that you had after watching the film? If so, what? And had you learned anything new from the other voices? And maybe not so much new, but it reminded you of things that you had thought about before.
Yeah, something that stuck out to me was just a comment that John made about the revitalization of East Austin, and he was talking about how he started noticing that they were changing, or they were digging in to change like the utilities to add all these things, and like that idea that, you know, that's not for us. And I'm living in Austin right now, especially. I'm kind of like east south Austin right now, south of the river, and there's all this construction going on right now, and it's just this, every time I see, you know, the road lines getting repainted or all this digging up of infrastructure, it's hard not to think that, you know, they're prepping this space for, you know, affluent people, affluent white people to take over pretty soon. And it's a little disheartening looking around and just knowing that a lot of the people are probably going to get priced out of this area, and that the only reason that these areas are being revitalized isn't really for the community that's there at the moment, but for the community they're expecting to have in the future. And that's something that kind of stuck with me from when I went to go see the show.
Well, when I was watching, well, thank you, John, for mentioning that sort of, I guess that's like Michael J. Love's sort of like answer to one of the issues. But it was really great for me to hear, will you speak, John, and then Deborah, and then also Cindy, just because I know Cindy and I know that she is originally from Austin. And I think sometimes when we have these conversations, like there's a question in the chat sort of about like Austin versus Dallas or Houston. We have these questions around like cities and like how can we like make cities diverse. I think personally, I think a lot in terms of like how can we bring Black millennials to cities. But I think hearing like Cindy talk about like what it was like to grow up, and like Deborah also talking about what it was like to grow up and be in Austin and then like leave and then return to Austin. I think an important piece of that is also when we're thinking about how to like make sure these cities are equal for everyone, or that everyone has access, right? And especially we're thinking about brown and Black people as we're thinking about sort of like the older Black families in East Austin, for example. So I think we also need to like remember that there's like such a deep, rich history, and maybe I'm just saying this for myself, but it's not just about like bringing in like the young millennial crowd, which I think that's like a way to make sure that a city is, you know, if we're saying that Austin is this like metropolitan liberal like blue dot city, I think there should be like an influx of like that person who is of that age and is like coming to like make change and do things and bring exciting new ideas and possibilities in people. But I also think it's important to like make sure that like the history is preserved and the people who are originally here, you know, still have what they need and they can live and prosper as well.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up because it makes me think about how even when I go to anywhere, my first question, and John, you said the same thing, you know, where are the Black people? You're like, where or what happened, you know? And I've had some friends who I've wanted to move to Austin just to have a community, and they just straight up told me, no, no, I'm not doing that because there's no Black community, there's no, you know, and what I mean by Black community, I don't mean just millennials, but like there's no older Black people, there's no Black children, you know, and I think that scares people away because then it's like, well, this is not friendly for the life that I would like to create for myself here. And you're absolutely right, Michael. I think, you know, especially today with so much globalism, millennials, I mean, we don't really have it's funny, Cindy brought this up, the fact that there are those who are mobile and those who are not. And I think about that a lot because my New York friends have been like, you need to leave the South. You need to leave the South. And I'm like, my family's here. What I'm like, how do I leave my family? It's like, how do you tell someone who immigrates to this country, like, yeah, it's a good thing you left your country because, but your family's still there. And I think a lot about the people who are not able to move anytime I go to a new place. So it's like, it's not just enough to bring young professionals, but it's also like what's going to keep them there is to see that their community can live. And if they don't see that, I mean, what's keeping them there, and I think, yeah, so that's what I have to say about that. I really am grateful for all of y'all. John, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to add that Cindy and Deborah's comments as people who were born in Austin were impactful for me. When I bought this place, my place now in East Austin in the mid 1990s, the East Side was completely isolated from the rest of the city. People that lived in East Austin didn't leave East Austin. People that didn't live in East Austin didn't come to East Austin. It was a small southern town in the middle of the city. But one of the things, and I bought the property from Grant Chapel AME Church. And so two of the buildings that I used outside of the house were the old school. And people would walk down the street and say, when do you open the school? Anytime I walked outside, everybody went to the school. Their parents went to the school. There was, and everywhere around this, there was nothing but that thick history. It was all Black, and so, as elders pass on and the property tax freeze goes away at 65, and families deal with kind of having a property tax that was, $800 that now is $15,000. They leave and they move. And so I've watched that attrition over the years, and I've watched neighbors, go away. And to the fact there are very, very few around me right now. And so I thought Cindy and Deborah's recollections of growing up were really impactful for me. So.
Same. And I remember, I had a laugh with Deborah because, when I asked her to relay her memories of growing up, she talked about the ice cream truck and, just really normal things. And I think that's really what I took away from both Deborah and Cindy's experience, is that what they had was a normal childhood. And so, yeah, thank you for that, John. I also just want to end this segment with, I think this work is not necessarily meant to call out white people. It's more like to call in and to really advocate for bravery and courage, because that's what it's going to take. It's going to take a level of bravery and courage to do without, to have a little less so someone can have a little more, to to show up and navigate these systems that are only meant for the privileged. And whether you're white, POC, or Black, I mean, there's levels of privilege, right? It's not just about bringing in the wealthy Blacks, or the wealthy people of color, but I think it requires some courage and bravery for everyone, because it does affect all of us, because we're not, it's awkward. It's very awkward. So thank you for this segment. Chris, should I go ahead and read the questions?
Sure, whatever. Any of the rest of you have other thoughts that Ariel didn't directly ask you? I mean, are there other things that?
No, I'm sure they will when I read the question. But yeah, thanks, Chris. So a question for the panelists from Miriam Connor: within sustainability and preservation for the future, how and what do the panelists think about how the arts and cultural economic system and organizations can help Black and Brown communities feel comfortable, and how are they creating the space to put the ownership back into Black and Brown communities' hands? Hmm. I don't know. I don't know, because I think that, you know, the arts and culture is the surface. In the sense that, you know, I think it depends on what we're talking about when it comes to the arts and culture, because while it is surface, it also is a way of communicating. And, you know, I think supporting the arts is maybe not enough because unfortunately, you know, and it's why I wanted to have the 24-hour screening, is that Black and Brown people don't feel comfortable already going into arts and, you know, even cultural centers that are meant for them. So I don't know if it's about only supporting arts and culture, but almost maybe saying no to some things. I don't know. I concede to whoever else has an idea.
I think that, you know, one of the things that is at least a possible kind of a part that is existent is that you do have some of the cultural institutions that have, I think, become our lifeboats a little bit right now. You know, so there is programming that is going on that, as you say, all those problems exist in terms of, you know, how to get people there. Because part of, as you say, Ariel, part of the problem is you have the programming there, but so many people have left. You know, so, you know, you have the institutions historically that have been here, and some new, you know, the Black art galleries and so on, and things that happen there are new kind of ideas. But you have the idea of the Carver, in terms of what the Carver has become since it's been rebuilt, and also since its new direction of exhibition programming, the African American Cultural Center. There are things that are there that we can build, but the investment needs to be there. It's a struggle to get money and funding. I think that these institutions are doing a great job with what they have, but, you know, I don't think Austin has, and I'm not as in touch as I used to be, but I don't think Austin has ever quite figured out how to get the funding right to balance, you know, some of the dynamics that have been shifting in this city. I look at the struggle that Harold Macmillan has trying to keep that Kenny Durham's backyard open and out of the hands of developers. And, you know, it's like so much energy has going to kind of hold on to what we have. So the arts play a role, but as you say, you know, we need the community. We need to rebuild the community in certain ways. So.
Yeah, and advocate. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do, especially when you have no stake in it. You know, to advocate on someone else who you don't know what their life is, or you know, anything. But hopefully with conversations like this, you get you know, the conversation that we've had together is not necessarily a conversation you're going to just have with somebody in the office or in the gallery or whatever. You know, these are relationships, and it's why I reached out to creatives, because that's mainly who I'm around. But also because I think that artists and creatives, you know, we have maybe a heavy burden to carry sometimes, in the sense that we have to be careful about the communities that we're in, because if we're too vocal sometimes with our artwork, I think sometimes we attract people who want to gentrify an area. So I've known artists who will hide out in the Bronx and not tell anybody that they're there. You know, and that is a moment of denial, like denying yourself that luxury of, you know, hey, I got a studio in the Bronx. It's really nice. It's really big. Come and see me. No, the person I'm talking about would keep it on one-to-one terms. So I think it's like, you know, I think it requires a little bit of strategic thinking in thinking about how both individual and community can help each other. Because I think when people get stuck in their own, you know, with their blinders on and just thinking about what they can get for themselves and then they can move on, I really think it's going to take for almost like a reconnection to how we think about community. Because I think that it is in the community where we learn about what's going on or what's going to happen. So I think that communication is key. And John, you said this, you said a lot of great things. I just want to say, like, I'm just so grateful. One of the things, of course, I forgot. One of the things that you said was having to do with, oh man, I lost it. I'm sorry. I was just like, I was showering you so much and then I forgot my train of thought.
I can add one more thing that might help a little bit. I'd be remiss being connected to the University of Texas to say one of the things people can do is start to really kind of engage and challenge the University of Texas. There's an idea of community outreach. There's also, in all universities, there's a history of colonialized outreach. So the idea is not asking the university, what do you want to do, but actually kind of like presenting things through the instruments that are in place right now, through diversity officers like myself or associate deans who are in charge of that. Through, there are vehicles, there are people that are there that will work with you, and it still is kind of climbing a mountain. Mind you, I'm not making it seem like you come and there's some open door, but I'm saying that is a huge powerhouse sitting in the middle of the city that has certainly kind of, at least in its public facing language, has talked about community engagement and making a community impact. And the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement has had community offices in the community. So the idea is to take these things and to pull them past the performative level and have the community actually challenge the University of Texas to utilize some of those resources in substantial ways. So, sorry, I had to put that in there.
It came back. Thank you, John. Back. I was thinking about how you said, let's have an honest conversation. And, honest conversations are not easy, but I really do believe that they present a way forward, in just being very honest about the situation. And John, you've always been honest with me about it. Even whenever I came here to like see it, I mean, I could have been like, oh no, forget this, I'm going back to but I really appreciated that because I think honesty shows that you care, because it's way easier not to be honest. It's a lot harder to just, and it's a lot easier not to advocate and to mind your business, keep your head down. And it's a lot harder to speak up, especially for somebody else where you have no stake in it. So Dina, I'm sorry, I might be saying your name wrong, but Diana Mish says, I began to hear about Black Austinites leaving more than a decade ago, and many going to either Dallas or Houston. Beyond the obvious of what Austin is doing wrong in regard to the Black community, what do you think Dallas or Houston is doing right? I love the inequity idea of Michael's that John brought up. Thank you for bringing this idea to the table, Ariel. Of course. And I think that's a great, I want to hear what y'all have to say about
that. I partly feel like having, when I moved to Texas, I initially moved to Houston. I think it's just partially based on demographics as well, just because living in Houston, I think I felt a lot more comfortable. It felt a lot more like New York in the sense that I was surrounded by people of color in most places that I was. And living in Austin, for me, it was a culture shock because it is so white, and everywhere you go, it feels like you're the odd person out. And I'm not so sure about Dallas just because I don't have as much of an experience with it. But I do feel that the inequality in Austin is just more visually noticeable. And I've talked to people about that have come to visit me in town, and it's always this question of like, oh, or not even a question, more of a statement or comment of like, man, Austin is so white. And it for me, it took me a few years before I really felt comfortable here, just because I felt like I was learning an entirely new culture and always feeling like I had to really think about what I was going to say because I was afraid of being seen as an outsider or not belonging. So for me, living in Austin felt like the more difficult just to feel like I belonged here. And even now, sometimes, I question, whether, I do belong here sometimes, just because um, I'm still so separated from my own family at this point. I'm like the only person who lives in this city. And I do have a lot of great friends here, but I don't have the type of ties that someone like Deborah Roberts had to this town, because I moved here because of school. And so that's, at least that's for me, that's the case with Houston, Austin.
So I had a friend once make a sort of, I guess, a hot take or a spicy statement, and it's really stuck with me throughout the years. And she said once that Austin is like the white Atlanta. I don't know. I think we're having all these conversations about like arts and culture and like funding. And John, when you were talking about funding and organizations, I was thinking a lot about all the organizations that I just did an event with Augo a few days ago, which is a queer people of color organization based in Austin. Just thinking about all the folks I know who were like organizing like social and civic events for like Black queer folks, and just what it was like to be like a 20-something Black queer person like wanting to go out and like not being able to like find a bar or a club that felt like it could be like a welcoming place for my friends and I to like hang out, to just like exist. And as someone who's like traveled to Houston a lot and has also thought about like moving to Houston at like many points throughout like living in Austin, and like even now I'm like, if I move back to Texas, Houston is definitely like at the top of the list of cities I would want to live in. But it's like just knowing that culture is there, and it's like super embedded, and there's like networks of people there, and there's organizations, and there's places to go, and people to see and things to do. And I don't know how tangible and how tangible this idea of like Austin being a white Atlanta is, but I think like certainly it's something that like I feel when I'm in Austin, right? Like even when you think about like Austin being like the live music capital of the world, like you're thinking about like, well, what genres of music, right, is that true for? And like it's interesting when big artists tour through Texas, it's like a lot of like Black R&B hip hop artists will like hit Dallas and Houston and like skip over Austin and like go on to the next. So it's just like all these little things that sort of like add up, that like turn into like real experiences for people. So yeah, I don't know if that's useful, but like that saying of like has always like stuck with me since my friend like told me that.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even know if we'd be able to really do justice to that question, because I think there's just so many different there's the specific histories of Dallas and Houston, even just thinking about culture. I mean, there is a New Orleans, Austin is kind of a New Orleans haven. Like I've met so many people from New Orleans, but they're all white. So that's curious. I don't have anything more to say about it. But in Houston, I know that most of my family, when they do think about Texas, they only think about Houston, unless they have family in Dallas. And I think maybe it's, I don't know, it's also, Deanna says, ha, I'm a white girl from NOLA. Even the white people from New Orleans are a little, unique. So, I mean, I think, but the website that I included in the documentary, my hope was that it would encourage people to take a look at it, because it's a really great project. And what it does is it maps inequality. It maps how real estate had been used in all of these big hubs. And I mean, I think the similarity between Austin, Dallas, Houston, and the rest is that they all had a similar code, color code, as if there was like, a meeting where, the color codes would be used in these cities where there's predominantly Black and brown people already, or if there's a population there already. And so I think that should be considered in thinking about, because I don't know if I would even say that Houston or Dallas is like maybe a better place. I think that the Black and brown communities in Houston and Dallas are better isolated, whereas East Austin and Austin being so small in comparison, you see what is probably already existing in Houston and Dallas. But you know, if you have your family in the struggle with you, it's very easy to ignore sort of the systemic things that are limiting you. Because that was a real big struggle after Hurricane Katrina, that a lot of people who were displaced had never been outside of New Orleans, let alone their ward. And so a person whose work I follow, and I'm blanking on their name, but they are in New Orleans and they are rethinking how displacement works now. Like in Austin, it is clear to see that the population is increasing, but the Black and brown population is decreasing. And I mean, brown as in like Hispanic, Latino specifically. But in New Orleans, it's like they're contained, out of sight, put out of sight behind like a bridge, right? Or behind like, I don't know, a series of stores, and behind that are the projects, or behind that is, you know, a poor neighborhood. And so I think that's why I'm so interested in land, because I think that we can talk about Houston, you know, Black, Creole, Hispanic culture. We can talk about Dallas in the same way, but they are still on that website, mapping inequality. Like there are still those systems that are building the places for Black and brown people to be isolated and contained.
One of the things that on that line, in Chicago, one of the things when I talk about, you know, even my things about infrastructure, our part in Chicago, race and real estate is a science. And I actually saw banks actually did have maps that were color coded. Chicago at that time had 93 neighborhoods and they all were racially labeled. And this was something that banks had and used, and I saw that with my own eyes. And so depending on where you are and what city, how Blacks were able to settle differed a little bit. And I think people remember that Blacks didn't leave Austin. They were priced out of Austin. They were priced out. They were forced out of Austin. And in Austin, different from what other cities where the Black population existed in various different ways. In Austin, remember that all of the areas where Blacks were, grew out of the freedmen's, you know, districts and so on. All those people were relocated, centralized into East Austin. And then after 2001, 2002, that whole concentration of Black people were forced out of Austin by price. And so we have a unique dynamic that's different from Dallas or Houston. Just our real estate realities, where and how people can live, you know, there's a more diverse rate of housing. You know, there are different kind of places you can rent. And in Austin, that diversity is really not very existent in many ways. So we concentrated all the Black folks in one place, and then we ran all the Black folks out. And that's why Austin is in the position it's in right now, as opposed to Dallas and Houston.
Thank you, John. I feel like you need to I need to interview you more often. There's just so much, like a wealth of information. Annette Carlassi, hi Annette, says, I think arts communities have a major function in providing and hosting these kinds of conversations about history of place, the inequitable availability of resources, and even the awkward social dynamics of any layered place. It seems to me that's what this very exhibition does, moves art alone to the side so that the larger social, economic, philosophical, and political issues can be looked at by artists and their allies. It's a good way to describe it. Moves art alone to the side. And you know, it brings up an interesting question for me in choosing to use conversations as material. I'm going to be giving a lecture on this at some point, so this will be good for me to think through. I have struggled with how a metaphor can be used as a tool or as a mode of thinking, and also thinking about what technology means. So technology, when broken down, essentially means like craft, technique. And I think about how the arts is in some ways a technology. It's how we pull at conversations and pull for language, right? Visually, and and how we actually create space, like John's murals and murals in general. To me, those are types of technologies. They facilitate, they carry, they I don't want to say contain or container, but they allow, I think, for at least for me, for my mind to relax and to think in a way that is not so much methodical, but embodied. Michael and I have been thinking about embodied knowledge, embodied information for a while now. And Vlad, I think your work also thinks about just, how do we imagine these experiences, these modes of living that, aside from poetry, it's really hard to talk about it without stepping on your own toes. And so it's one of the reasons why I'm not going to be a historian, even though I've been flattered to be called a historian. For me, it's not really that I'm a historian, like, oh, listen to me. It's more like, I need to understand what's happening. I need to understand what's happening around me. And I think that is the work. I think the way that we craft together these narratives based on the information, based on the experiences that we have, I think that is the art. And I think that all art comes with, a layered intentions, whether that is class, whether that is race, ethnicity, right? All of those things come into play when we're creating our art. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that art is being set aside, but that art is being questioned about its about what it physically does, right? The art world is so massive. There's so many different types of art. So I would even suggest that this is what the poet Anais Duplan calls a documentary poetics. And docu-poetics is mainly a term used in literature. It's used by poets, but I think it belongs in art. I think it's always been there in art. There is a method of documenting that happens in, I think most artists practice, like you're documenting the world around you. And so I think it's important to not just limit what you document to be objects, but also experiences and people. So that's what I have to say about that. And thank you for that, for giving me the space to think about that, Annette. Dina says, our state government is not incentivized to fix the property tax system. I guess it's working for them in terms of helping the haves. If we can make the property taxes reasonable again, if we can make the police behave, would our expat Black and Brown community return? No. I mean, I'm getting too comfortable. I just don't think you'll be able to make the police behave in our lifetime, because that's a role that was created in slavery. So, that, like John said, it's a cycle. It's going to keep happening. So maybe the question is, how do we break those cycles, or how do we challenge them? How do we slow them down? Unfortunately, yeah, I think that things like the property tax, don't see that changing for a while, mainly because that's part of a larger national issue of people just not being paid enough to live. So I feel like that conversation can only be had when people are paid a living wage. So it's kind of like, picking your battles. I think that's maybe too big of a battle to pick. But I think about how Black and brown people have really practiced sustainability. Somebody was telling me, you know, thinking about like survival, like Black survival, and how Black people are so resilient. I'm like, I don't know if Black people are resilient. I think that we are sustainable. We are forced to be sustainable. You know, you saw it in Snowvid. I mean, you acclimate. You throw your food in the snow, right? Because it's the only thing you can do when you can't, you know, drop another $80 on groceries. You know, like these are the things that I think would encourage Black and brown people to return, is if there is a practice of sustainability with people's lives, with how we care for people. So it's not so much like, well, the problems are too big, we can't solve the problems. It's more like, how do we mitigate the damage that it's having, where you have Black and brown people who are more susceptible to the vaccine because they are literally providing services. So it's like, what are the services that can be provided for them, right? Like how can those actions be reciprocated individually as well as communally, right? Kay says to everyone, you're right, we are still growing in the diversity of the music and art industry. The Coconut Club is a new location that opened, which younger brown people are going to. Awesome. I've seen a majority of brown faces. Also, Cheer Up Charlie's is owned by a POC LGBT owner. That's true. Just a plug for these places. Great. Kendall's from New Orleans as well. Yes, Ariel, to your thoughts about NOLA, histories of highways, avenues, projects, etc., and knowing that some Black communities were purposefully placed in environmentally risky sites. Yeah, that was something that I became aware of when I was in Bentonville. Sharon Killian, who's an artist local to that area, was explaining to me the incentive for Black and brown people to be pushed away from the hills into what's considered like the bowl. It's below sea level. And just in thinking about how life has changed from before, where we didn't have like indoor plumbing, when, you know, like we didn't have like electricity, everyone didn't have electricity. And so living in these low-lying areas was awesome during colonial times. But now that we have electricity and now that we have plumbing, there's no reason for those with money and influence and privilege to live in the low-lying areas. That's something I've been just like very aware of, especially in New Orleans, where you have very specific areas that are below sea level, and seeing how those areas have, you know, those were the areas where Black people could get a house and if they wanted to live there, you know, but I don't know how, you know, nobody's in the room there, but the actions speak for themselves. It's just very curious to see how Black and brown people are placed in these very nefarious areas. Kendall then says, when I think about a welcoming place, I think about, quote, is it sustainable for me and my family to live here for generations? And with the history of migration in Black families, the answer often feels like no. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, when I was in New York, I came across many, many people who had a romantic and stereotypical idea of the South. And I think that's going to take a long time for that opinion to change. Okay. I don't think there's any actual questions left. Kay says, thanks for the projects. Yes, possibilities of using Instagram, engage our friends on conversations or art projects on what is equity and equality. What does it look like to you? Have kids and people share personal examples of what can be done, what have they seen, and what dreams can be shared. I don't know if kids know that yet. I don't think I knew that when I was a kid. Like, I don't even think I knew what equity meant, what the definition of equity was. But I do think, having that be a constant conversation, yes, I'm all for it. I think this should be a constant conversation about what equity is. And I think this show left me thinking with equity is making sure that everyone has the ability to have a home, everyone to have the ability to have food, like very basic things. So yeah, Kevin Clark says, equity refers only to race. It ignores sexuality and gender. Yeah. Usually equity only refers to race, but yeah, that conversation is tangential to this one for sure. So I'm gonna leave it for last thoughts. I was talking for a while, so, but thank you again just for being here with me. Just seeing y'all's faces without masks on is just really, I usually get exhausted from stuff like this, but this is really giving me life. So I appreciate Vlad, Michael, John, women in their work for, being brave.
Thank you for the work, Ariel. Magnificent piece. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say thank you. It was really great to see all the conversations together, and very poetic as well. And I think, something that came up in our conversation when we talked was also about how, these conversations will continue, into the future. And like, it is like cycles, but I think the idea is just to make things a little better, little by little. And, we won't be able to fix everything, with one action, but making things better for people in the future is kind of just the best that we can hope for. And that's a great thing to do.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. This has been really powerful, and I really thank you. So.
Yeah, thank you all so much for these conversations. Thank you, Ariel. I was so glad we were able to host this and extend kind of the work with this conversation today. I hope you will all join us for the closing reception on March 3rd. We didn't have an opening reception, as you all probably know. So please join us on March 3rd, and thank you for being here tonight.
As serious as I am, March 3rd is going to be a party. Okay. I can be serious and fun.
That's what we're counting on. We're counting on it. Good night. Good night, all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.